And it looks like we're live at the moment, but we're just going to hold on for a few moments with Richard, just to let a few more people join in the call. So please bear with us. And for those who've already joined, just want to let everyone know that there is a Q&A area in the Teams chat, and we'll be open to questions all the way through the talk. So we'll keep it a little bit lively, and feel free to post questions as we go through. So quite a few people sort of jumping in now. Maybe a minute or two to go. So I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Happy New Year to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for the 5th in the Meaning of Light series of talks, and of course the first for 2025. And a huge welcome to Richard Weller, Professor Richard Weller. Thank you very much for joining us from Edinburgh today. Just a little bit about the series. The Meaning of Light series is a series of talks exploring the topic of light and our connection to it. And today we have the pleasure of having Richard with us, and we'll be diving into the topic of sunlight, time for a rethink. We've looked at the infrared revolution with Glenn Jeffrey and Bob Fosbury, and in December we talked with Scott Zimmerman about melatonin, light and the optics of the human body. These were really focused on the longer wavelengths of light. Today we'll be talking much more about UV, the shorter wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the impact that these wavelengths have on us. Both UV and infrared are showing to be critical elements for our health and well-being, yet they no longer form a significant part of our lives as we spend 90% of our time indoors. Scott Zimmerman has quoted or said, sunlight used to represent the largest energy input into the human body, and that was in reference to infrared. So what happens at the other end of the electromagnetic spectrum? I think we're going to find out. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. If anybody wants to ask questions through the talk, please do so. Use the Q&A area, fire questions away, and I'll jump in with Richard. To get going, Richard, if you don't mind, maybe let's start with a bit about you.
Yep. So I'm a professor of dermatology, a professor of medical dermatology at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a clinical academic, so I spend half my time seeing patients. Today's a clinical day. I've been seeing patients all morning and teaching my registrars this afternoon. And then half the time I do research. So that's really, I think I'll cover a bit about where I've been in the talk, about what kind of led me to where I am. And really my main research interest now is on the systemic health benefits of sunshine, which is an unusual position for a dermatologist, but very much it's the data that's led me here, and it's data that leads science.
And I think when we spoke some months ago, I questioned how you'd got to, the place that you're at today, on the basis that, for an ordinary sort of layperson, dermatology has been sort of pushing the narrative around staying away from the sun.
Yeah, and look, I started off like that. I'm not a natural rebel like most doctors. I'm rather dutiful, worked hard at school, did as I was told, got the exams, went to medical school, worked hard, did as I was told, didn't work that hard. Anyway, but the point was, most of us are fairly but you do science, and science I think is self-correcting. I think we have gone wrong about sunlight. I think we've gone wrong in dermatology about sunlight, and certainly in medicine, as I'll be showing in this talk. But science is self-correcting. It's not a monolith. As the data and the evidence changes, so does scientific advice. And so the way you said about changing things is not by beating your chest and shouting and emoting. You do it with data, and you do it with science, and you do it with proof. And science, the great thing about science is it's self-correcting. It's not, this is it, we'll use leeches, the sun moves around the earth. It's something where you analyze the data, you interpret it, you correctly adjust for confounders, do experiments. And when you have data that is adequate, then science changes. Basically, medicine is the stuff that worked. and that's almost the definition of medicine.
So from there, do we jump straight into sort of the research that you've been
I'd be
working on?
happy to take that on a go. So shall I do a share screen here?
Okay.
Here we come. There we are. Is that appearing in front of you?
That has certainly appeared for me, so I'm hoping it's appeared for everybody else.
Right. Well, look, great to be speaking to you, Alyssa. And look, I have to say it's really interesting. I'm a dermatologist, and I am coming at this from a dermatologist angle. Of course, dermatologists are interested in ultraviolet because of skin cancer, and that's what we look about, and that's what I've been looking at. And I've found these health benefits of UV. It is really interesting that circadian biologists have been looking at blue light and circadian rhythm, and ophthalmologists have been looking at daylight and short sight, and then there's a whole kind of infrared world. So all of us have really started in different places within the solar spectrum based on our background, but it's fascinating how separate researchers are coming in from different areas and finding different benefits of sunlight. And I suspect there are benefits to sunlight really across the spectrum, and I'm going to talk a bit about kind of evolutionary factors leading to that. But anyway, so here am I. I'm in Edinburgh. This is a classic opening slide. I'm actually at the moment on a clinic on an NHS day, seeing clinical patients just on the left-hand side of this picture. And then I also actually work over in the university. So on the right here is the building where I do my research 3 days a week on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and that's the new hospital on the edge of Edinburgh. And my talk today really divided into 4 main sections. It's based largely on a talk I give to doctors. So I've tried to keep it relatively data light, to tell the story. But it kind of, I suppose there's a few main things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start off talking about sunlight and nitric oxide. This is the mechanism I found far more important than vitamin D, which accounts for the beneficial effects of sunlight on heart disease. I'm then going to talk about sunlight and all-cause mortality. Does sunlight make you live longer or shorter? Because that in the end is what matters. I'm then going to talk a bit about sunlight and melanoma, and then actual failures in, I suppose, healthcare delivery at the moment. And what I'm wanting people to get the idea of here is risk-benefit ratios. What doctors deal with, almost the core of what we do, is risk-benefit ratios. When I prescribe a drug for one of my patients, I think of the benefits, the condition I'm going to get better with my medicine. And I think about the risk, the side effect profile of that drug. When I cross the road, I think of risk-benefit profile. The risks, what are my chances of being run over? The benefits, I need to do my shopping and go to the shops. And I make that subconsciously, I make that calculation with everything you do in life. And what I'm hoping to persuade you is that in medicine, in dermatology, we have understated the benefits of sunlight, the all-cause mortality stuff, and we have overstated the risks. This is sunlight and melanoma. And both of those shift towards us wanting light because of improved benefits, and the risks are much less than has been stated. So that's the background to the talk. I'm going to start by saying our attitudes to sunlight have really changed in the last 100 years. So, top left is Davos. Well, Davos now is a place where bankers go to meet each other once a year, a ski resort. It was, of course, originally a sanatorium where you went with tuberculosis to have your TB treated with heliotherapy 100 years ago. The next picture down, children in Bristol, 100 almost 100 years ago in Bristol, children with rickets or TB were treated with UV therapy, with UV lamps. Here in Edinburgh, this bottom left picture is from Edinburgh in the very early 1950s, just before multibacterial treatment was brought in for tuberculosis. And because we couldn't afford to send people off to Davos, in the Western General Hospital, actually my hospital, they had these little bungalows, little garden huts on a railway turntable in the grounds of the hospital, and patients were put in there to face the sun, and it was turned to face the sun. So that was state-of-the-art treatment, only 70 years ago. Or in Glasgow, you could buy a cage to put your child in. You could put your child in your tenement flat. You could get a cage that hung outside your flat to put your baby in. Now, our Glaswegians tell us that was to get sunlight to reduce rickets in their children. In Edinburgh, we consider this was preparing Glasgow children for life behind bars. But who knows which of these is the right explanation? So that was 100 years ago. And what's our attitude to sunlight today? Well, this is a picture given to me of Ulis on the beach in Wales next to sea only last summer, so scared of sunlight affecting his beautiful complexion. He's completely covered up. More sit-ups is my advice, Ulis. Just take it from a friend.
For sure.
So why this complete change in our attitude to sunlight? And of course, it's skin cancer. So this is the official Cancer Research UK page on ultraviolet. Most skin cancers are caused by overexposure to ultraviolet radiation. So, whether you're at home or abroad, use shade clothing and SPF sunscreen to protect yourself. So this is the official guidance on sunlight. But how dangerous is sunlight for health overall? So the World Health Organization every 5 or 6 years collates the risk factors leading to premature death and disease around the world, what's called disability adjusted life years. So a DALY, a disability adjusted life year, is a composite measure made up showing you how much individual risk factors cause early death and how much they cause disease. And the leading cause, in fact, it's just been overtaken by air pollution, actually. But the ambient particulate matter pollution is like on the top. But the sort of the two leading causes of premature death and disease are high blood pressure, then air pollution and smoking. And the reason high blood pressure is so dangerous is high blood pressure leads to heart attacks and strokes. And those are the two major causes of death worldwide today. And what is interesting about blood pressure is each of these dots on the left-hand graph. Are you able to see my pointer on this, Ulis? Yep.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can see. Yep.
So each of these dots represents a different country in the world, but they're plotted against. And what I've done is I plotted the average population blood pressure on the y-axis against latitude on the x-axis, distance from the equator. So the equator runs up the middle here. And the further north or south a country is, the greater the population blood pressure. Now, importantly, this data is taken from 1980, before modern effective blood pressure medication was brought in. Because what's happened now is in the rich world, blood pressure has come down because it's aggressively treated by family doctors because it is such an important thing. But before that became available, you have this incredibly striking latitude gradient. Higher latitude, less sunlight, higher blood pressure. But you could, of course, quite fairly say, well, maybe it's not sunlight, maybe it's some diet or genetics or lifestyle or other factors. Different countries, people have different lifestyles. But within a country, the graph on the right, the graph on the right is a clinical trial I studied at medical school years back. Two different treatments for high blood pressure, control group on the right, different treatment groups. But when you analyze blood pressure by month of the year, everyone's blood pressure is lower in summer than in winter. And in fact, the seasonal effect is as big as the drug effect. So the difference between summer and winter in terms of blood pressure is as big as a drug effect. And if you plot the average sunlight in different countries, again, each dot's a different country in the world. If you plot the average sunlight in a country against the risks of heart attacks or strokes, what you find is the sunnier country is, the less the rate of heart attacks and strokes, the biggest killers in the world. So, very interesting. The leading news story this morning when I woke up to the Today programme was the fact the NHS is again collapsing, emergencies declared across hospitals in the NHS. And this occurs every winter and has done so from throughout recorded history. So this graph here shows it's males in Scotland, but it applies to females and it applies to England as well. It's risks of dying from any cause in each week of the year in Scotland. And this, I tell you, January is an antsy time for me. I am 30% more likely to drop dead this week than a week in July. And this occurs every year. Every winter, hospitals have a winter bed crisis. Well, we used to. Nowadays, there is a 365-day-a-year bed crisis. When I was a trainee, it was seasonal. The point is, hospitals are overwhelmed in winter because we know every winter people are sicker than in summer. Hippocrates described this 2,500 years ago. In one of Hippocrates' books, he pointed out that disease was affected by season. Why this difference? Well, the first thing to talk about is vitamin D. When I talk about sunlight, most people instantly say vitamin D. So they say vitamin D. And the reason for this is rickets. So this child here is a child in Glasgow 100 years ago. So almost 2,000 children back in 1920s Glasgow had rickets. And this was a mixture of poverty, poor diet, and lack of light. And it was discovered actually in 1919, first of all, that if you shine UV at children, you cure their rickets. It was then discovered that the mechanism for this was that sunlight creates vitamin D. And instead of shining UV at people, you could give them vitamin D supplements. So rickets is cured either by giving UV or by giving vitamin D. And the reason for that is rickets is caused by vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D can be obtained either by sunlight or by vitamin D supplementation. And fixed in the minds of the public is the fact that sunlight is vitamin D and vitamin D is sunlight. And that is incorrect. Sunlight acts in multiple ways. Its mechanisms, it has multiple mechanisms of action. Vitamin D is only one of the mechanisms of action, and it only accounts for some of sunlight's benefits. Now, the way to see, measured vitamin D levels in the blood are a great indicator for how much sunlight you have been exposed to, because sunlight makes vitamin D. So if you look at people with high blood pressure, this is the results of what's called a meta-analysis. All the studies of vitamin D and blood pressure have been thrown together and are being combined in one mega study called a meta-analysis. And what we know is that the lower people's measured vitamin D is, the greater their risks of having high blood pressure or in fact of having heart disease of any kind. However, if you want to find causation, whether it's vitamin D preventing the high blood pressure, you need to do a clinical trial. You need to give people half get vitamin D, half get a placebo control. Neither knows which they've had. The doctor doesn't know which they've had. Only later we unblind it. So you then what's called a randomized double-blind placebo control trial. And 250,000 people around the world have been in clinical trials of vitamin D supplements. And vitamin D has, this is all these trials put together. And the end result is that vitamin D has absolutely no effect on heart attacks. It has no effects on strokes, and it has no effects on cancer. So the observational association between low vitamin D and higher risks of heart attacks and strokes does not show causation. It's not caused by vitamin D. It's a sunlight action separate from vitamin D. So vitamin D is a biomarker for sunlight exposure, and then in small print, which prevents rickets in children. The vitamin D industry is worth $3 billion a year in America alone. It's a huge industry. it has very little evidence underpinning its benefits beyond rickets. So here we are. Sunlight stops rickets and it makes people live longer. So the vitamin D accounts for the rickets. What accounts for the rest of it? So I'm now going to move on to nitric oxide, so an alternative mechanism by which sunlight reduces blood pressure. So nitric oxide, for those who haven't come across it, is a hugely important chemical messenger. And it was first described by this chap, Bob Furchgott, who was a fantastic researcher, ultimately at New York University. And he showed that in endothelial cells, the lining cells of blood vessels, contain this enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. And he shows that nitric oxide synthase in the linings of blood vessels releases NO from arginine, and that dilates blood vessels and lowers blood pressure. And he got the Nobel Prize for this back in 1998. So this was a huge, a really important discovery. And what was amazing was this very simple molecule, nitric oxide, a nitrogen atom and an oxygen atom together would have such profound effects in regulating our blood pressure. And of course, what was interesting was previously when we thought about chemical messengers in the body, carrying signals from one part of the body to another, we always thought about very complex things like hormones, which are these very complex 3D structures, and they fit into very complex receptors and spark off pathways. And here was this incredibly simple molecule, 2 atoms that have these profound effects. And one of the questions, well, how do you turn the effect off? And it was realized early on that the NO could be oxidized to NO2 and further oxidized to NO3 nitrate, which was then peed out in the urine. And it was thought that nitrate was an irreversible end product of NO synthesis, and that's how you got rid of it. So at the time of the Nobel Prize, that was the existing paradigm. Really important thing, lowers blood pressure, backgrounds, blood pressure regulation, and you pee out nitrate. I, as a young dermatologist, moved to Aberdeen about 30 years ago, and working there with a fantastic and inspirational character, Ben Benjamin, a clinical pharmacologist, he showed the first alternative pathway for nitric oxide synthesis. He showed that nitrate in saliva was broken down by bacteria on the tongue to nitrite, which you swallowed into the stomach, where NO was released. Really big, important paper in Nature, a second pathway by which NO could be made. And then another friend, John Lundberg, over at Karolinska in Sweden, showed that a high nitrate diet, particularly from beetroot, enhanced this further. And he showed that the increased NO resulting from this actually helped athletic performance. Nitric oxide reduced oxygen demand. And he showed that a high nitrate diet containing beetroots improved athletic performance by this pathway. And I remember just before the London Olympics, John was called up to the International Olympic Committee, who were deciding whether beetroot should be banned as a performance-enhancing vegetable, because all the athletes were taking huge amounts of beetroot because it improved their performance. And it was decided it couldn't be. But apparently the urinals in London ran pink because all the distance athletes were knocking back huge quantities of beetroot. Anyway, I was working with Ben, and we then showed actually another pathway. And I showed as a young trainee dermatologist that this pathway of Ben's releasing nitric oxide also occurred on the skin surface, which I then published back in 1996. So we have 2 big pathways for making nitric oxide, the Nobel Prize winning pathway and Ben and John's and my pathway from nitrate. Well, I then headed off, came down to Edinburgh to start my clinical training. I then went abroad to Germany first, to Düsseldorf, to Heinrich Heine, Victoria Kohlbachhofen. And then I went over to Pittsburgh for a couple of years in the States. And I was trying to work out what this nitric oxide was doing on the skin. So Nobel Prize for Medicine had happened in the meantime for NO, so it was a very hot topic. But we couldn't work out why the skin released nitric oxide. This is a blood vessel relaxing molecule. What's it doing on the skin surface? What's the relevance to it? So I spent 3 years, hard working away in the lab, came up with some, turns out, fairly irrelevant stuff, moved back to Edinburgh, and I've been doing mouse work in America, looking at skin cells. I assumed at that point that sunlight was bad for you and caused skin cancer and should be avoided. And I thought the nitric oxide must be something to do with cancer and cancer pathways, because that's what dermatologists believe. And that's what I was focusing on. So I came back to Edinburgh and I took on Megan Mowbray, she's now a consultant and friend of mine over in Fife. She was a trainee then and came to do 2 years research with me. And we were trying to repeat my mouse work in man. So our experimental animal in Edinburgh is a medical student. They're kind of cheaper than mice, don't have to shave them, feed themselves. They're a close species close to man. And we were trying to turn off this Nobel Prize winning pathway and see what happened when we shone UV, when we turned off the Nobel Prize winning pathway, the nitric oxide synthase pathway. The problem was, whatever we did, however we blocked this pathway, we couldn't turn off nitric oxide release when we shone UV at people. And all these experiments not working, years and years working, or 2 years working away at it. But what we found in problem solving our experiments was that the skin contains these really large stores of nitrate and nitrite and nitrosophiles. And at the time, really because of the lab I'm working in, because of the Nobel Prize leaving a big influence on the field, and the lab I've been working in America, I was only thinking of this Nobel Prize winning pathway. I wasn't thinking about alternate pathways of NO production. And we ran a meeting in Bregenz on Lake Constance in Austria. So my German boss, Victoria, was there. My European colleagues and friends, Pelly was there, Ben, Martin Feelish, who had been in Louisiana and had then moved to Britain, and ran this meeting. So there's an opera festival in Bregenz on the lake every year. And if anyone's seen the movie Quantum of Solace, there's a James Bond movie. They filmed it on the opera set, which they'd just finished filming, and the opera just finished when we were there. This is the set at the time. Anyway, opera festival finished, and then the opera house is cheap to hire for a cheap academic meeting. So we hired the opera house after the festival finished this meeting. And we were standing in the bar at the end of the day, chatting away. And I said, I've got this real problem. We've got all of these stores of nitrogen oxides in the skin. We're shining UV. I'm turning off the nitric oxide synthase pathway, but still NO is released. What could this be? And Martin said, oh, I've found this third pathway by which NO is released. So Martin was doing this mechanistic paper 5 years before that nobody had read. And he had shown that there was a huge debate in the nitric oxide world about how you measured NO. So there was one group that shone UV photolysis, and it shone UV at samples and at much higher NO levels than everybody else. And the rest of us measured it in a different way at much lower levels. And Martin had shown that if you shine UV at nitrate in the presence of these chemical groups called thiols, there is a photo reduction of NO3 to NO2 and NO. And I went, hang on, I've got lots of nitrate in the skin, lots of UV hits the skin, and there's lots of these thiol groups again. All of these ingredients meet in the skin. I wonder if sunlight is releasing NO by this pathway. And I could also remember that blood pressure is lower in summer than winter, which no one had ever explained. So we had this literally at the bar at the end of the day, chatting away discussion. And we quickly published, I've always called it my lamppost paper. Science is very competitive. And if you have an idea and finding, you want to publish it first. So it's your idea. The Nobel Committee doesn't hang about. And so we quickly published this paper, Martin and Victoria and John and Christoph and me and Donald. And we said, we think this is happening in the skin. We think that sunlight releases NO in the skin, and that probably accounts for lower blood pressure in summer. And then the race was on to prove it. So I came back to Edinburgh, and with my PhD student at the time, Donald, first of all, we shone UV at the skin, and we showed when you shine UV at the skin, it releases nitric oxide. These are volunteers. We then did these, I did a TED talk on this, if anybody watches TED Talks. We then did these quite invasive experiments where you take volunteers, you put them beneath UV lamps, and what you do is you put a blood pressure cuff around the upper arm, and you inflate the blood pressure cuff to above venous but below arterial pressure. So blood can flow into the arm, but it can't flow out. And you put a strain gauge around the forearm that shows how much the arm has expanded. And basically, if arteries are relaxed, more blood flows in, and there's more dilation. So this technique was developed by Ben Benjamin, my old mentor, and then Patrick Vallance, who was a trainee with Ben. Patrick Vallance was chief scientist during COVID, if you remember. So Patrick and Ben had developed this technique together. And so and what we showed was that when you shine UV at the forearm, it dilates arteries. We then showed that it lowered blood pressure, and we showed that it increased nitric oxide in the circulation. So sunlight hits the skin, releases nitric oxide in the skin, which moves to the circulation, which dilates arteries, which lowers blood pressure. So sunlight, separately from vitamin D, can lower blood pressure. So, fantastic. I published this. Zero interest from the dermatology world. Why on earth would a dermatologist be interested in blood pressure? They're really not interested in how long people live. They have no interest in. I'm being overcritical of my specialty, but there was not any interest from dermatologists because to them sunlight's evil. Full stop. I don't want to hear any more. There was, however, considerable interest from the medical world. And some of the people who approached me were what are called the Renal Research Institute. So this is the research arm of a company called Fresenius, who make dialysis machines and provide 90% of all the dialysis machines in the United States. And they are really interested in blood pressure control because high blood pressure is what kills dialysis patients. And it's very difficult to control blood pressure in dialysis patients because using drugs is very hard for somebody on renal dialysis. But they have amazing data because they've got over 1/3 patients in America, and dialysis patients have their blood pressure measured 3 times a week in, week out, year in, year out. So they have a massive blood pressure measurements. And they had dialysis centers all over America, 2,000 different dialysis centers. Now, depending on where you are in America, on the latitude, on the season, on the time of day, there are different amounts of UV and also a different range of the spectrum of UV, different wavelengths, and also different temperatures. So we had literally terabytes of data. But what we were able to show was that, well, first of all, the seasonal changes in blood pressure. About half of seasonal changes in blood pressure are caused by temperature. You know, when it's warmer, blood pressure is lower. But half of seasonal changes in blood pressure are unrelated to temperature. They're just caused by UV. So it's UV which is lowering blood pressure. We know from the clinical trials that vitamin D has no effect on blood pressure. So previously, always the story has been, oh, blood pressure's so much higher in winter because it's cold and lack of vitamin D. It's not vitamin D. You give people vitamin D, it has no effect. It's a bit of it temperature, but only half of it. The other half is ultraviolet itself. We showed that UVB was more important. And the other thing we showed was that skin color matters. So skin color is an adaptation to different amounts of sunlight in the world. And we showed that white people have a bigger fall in blood pressure than black people for the same rise in UV. Now, this matters because if you have dark skin, you need more sunlight to get the same benefits from UV. So
Richard, sorry,
yeah,
just on that point, interesting that there seems to be a sort of a parallel because from what I've read, the same is said about vitamin D synthesis.
indeed, indeed, absolutely right. And what is madness is that we have a universal advice on UV. Everybody must protect themselves from sun. Well, if you have darker skin, look, so white skin, as we're moving on to, is an adaptation to lack of sunlight. White skin evolves when humans move to low light environments like Europe, like China, to make up the lack of sunlight. If you are dark skin, you have no risk of UV-induced skin cancer. UV-induced skin cancer does not occur in black people, does not occur. I work in Ethiopia a lot. There is no UV-induced skin cancer there, nor does it occur in Asians, South Asians. So there is no risk of UV-induced skin cancer with dark skin. But at the same time, you need far more sunlight to get the benefits, to get the vitamin D and to get the blood pressure reduction. So it really matters.
Do you mind me asking just one more quick question? My understanding of vitamin D synthesis is that the UV index needs to be 3 or above. Is that the same with NO, or actually is that very different?
Yeah, really good question. And the answer is we don't know because I've not managed to get the funding for it. So yeah, so look, so vitamin D synthesis is a marker for sunlight exposure. The question is, how accurate a marker is it for the beneficial effects of sunlight? And that would be really good because it might well be that, there's guidance around how much sunlight you need to make vitamin D. Well, from the point of view of if you haven't got rickets, it doesn't matter. But actually, if those vitamin D levels are a marker for having had enough sunlight of the right wavelengths to do other good stuff, then fine, use it as an endpoint. It's a marker for other good things, but we don't know. So look, so in Britain, this is my kids in the garden in winter and in summer. Variation in blood pressure in Britain is about 6 millimeters of mercury systolic over 3 diastolic. If you lower people's blood pressure, lowering blood pressure dose dependently reduces your risks of a fatal heart attack. A reduction in blood pressure of 6 millimeters in mercury reduces your risks of death from a heart attack by about 20%. And indeed, your risk of having a heart attack, a fatal heart attack, is about 23% greater in winter than summer. So, that's why the hospitals are full at the moment. So assuming, just as a thought experiment, if dermatologists achieved their goal and every Briton received winter levels of sunshine all year, and if, which it wouldn't, that completely eradicated melanoma, but caused a 20% rise in deaths from cardiovascular, even a 10% rise, even if, half of its temperature, half of its UV. So if it caused a 10% increase in cardiovascular mortality, can I suggest that 10% of 170,000 is rather more people dying than the 2,500 who died of melanoma, just as a thought experiment? But what does the actual data show you? So this is really what we're moving on to now. So my interest now has been, what is the overall effect of sunlight on all-cause mortality, death from any cause? So we published a paper about 2 months ago, which had really fairly extensive coverage in the media. The Economist ran a leading article on it. It was in all the other mainstream articles. So my interest was on what does sunlight do to lifespan? Because when you're trying to balance up risks and benefits, the great way of seeing whether the risks or the benefits are greater is to look at all-cause mortality, overall death rates. So we use the UK Biobank. So the UK Biobank, 500,000 people, 400,000 people we used, but 500,000 people were recruited between about 2000 and 2004. I was one of them. And a mass of measurements were taken from all of the people in that study. Life questionnaires on lifestyles, measurements made, genotypes done. It was about a 3-hour assessment period. And Britain and Scandinavia is a great place to do these kind of studies because we have universal health records, because we have a common health system, common cancer records, common death records. We can follow up what happens to people very accurately. So what we wanted measures of sunlight exposure. So we used 2 separate indicators of sunlight exposure. The first one, I hardly dare say this as a dermatologist, we looked at sunbed users. Now, we didn't look at sunbed users necessarily because of the sunbeds, but really as a behavioral marker, because we know that sunbed users actively seek the sun more. They sunbathe, they expose more of themselves to the sun, they actively go out to get the sun. So that was our first marker for sunlight exposure, a behavioral marker. The second measure for sunlight exposure was a geographical marker of sunlight. It was how far north or south you live in the UK, because the further south you live in the UK, the closer to the equator, the more sunlight. Now, really importantly, you have to adjust for confounders. So confounders are things associated with your measure, sunbed use or living further south, that might separately from sunlight affect your risks of dying. So we looked at age, obesity, smoking, gender, employment, exercise, education, deprivation levels. So, sunbed users are younger, more female, more Mancunian, more likely to smoke, less educated, broadly. So you adjust for that. The further south you live, again, younger, more female, more educated, less likely to smoke, higher incomes. So you adjust for these confounders. Now, one of the key things here, you're always worried in observational studies that there's a confounder you haven't thought about that might, an unmeasured, that might account for your results. Say, I don't know, some amazing bit of research shows that people that paint their toenails green via some amazing mechanism live longer, and we hadn't thought about it. Well, there would have to be an association between painting your toenails green and using sunbeds and living further south for that to be a account for it. So the point about having different multiple measurements of sunlight exposure and the fact the confounders move differently for both of them makes it highly unlikely that an unmeasured confounder, something else, is accounting for your results. It's called triangulation, and it's an important technique in epidemiology to risk unmeasured confounder skewing results. So the next thing we did was we looked at vitamin D levels as a confirmation that our measure of sunlight exposure worked. So we find that sunbed users do indeed have much higher vitamin D levels than non-sunbed users. So that confirms to us that our sunbed question is a good marker for sun-seeking behavior. We adjusted for all of these confounders. So what do we find? So 12 years after recruitment to the study ended, we've called solarium sunbed users were 15% less likely to be dead than non-sunbed users after adjusting for all those confounders. In particular, they were less likely to have died of heart disease, 23% less likely, They were less likely to die of cancer, 14% less likely to have died of cancer. Reductions in deaths from all of the cancers. Melanoma, slight increase in cases of melanoma, no change in deaths from melanoma. All the other cancers reduced. And then other conditions, the other conditions, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, etc., also reduction. So, and sunbed users after 12 years had a 50-day longer lifespan than non-sunbed users. Now, I'm just going to reiterate this. This is an observational study. Observational studies do not prove causation. This doesn't say that sunbeds make you live longer. It said that sunbed users live longer. To prove that sunbeds make you live longer, you need to a randomized clinical trial. You randomly allocate people to sunbeds or no sunbeds. You follow them up and see what happens. That we didn't do. This isn't proof of causation. It's a correlation. Nonetheless, sunbeds are not harmful for you. If sunbeds kill people, would have found that. So that's our first measure of sunlight exposure. So I was doing this work with Chris Dibben, who's a professor of geography here. Our next measure was how far south you live. So we looked at, so the further south people live, the higher their vitamin D levels. The more UV people are exposed to, and the higher the vitamin D. So again, this confirms that southerliness, northerliness, is a good indicator for sunlight exposure. And we found the difference between living in Glasgow and Truro in terms of sunlight is 6% reduced all, this is every 300 kilometers further south. So not a big thing. So every 300 kilometers further south, 6% reduction in all-cause mortality, 9% in cardiovascular mortality, 7% reduction in cancer mortality. Not quite so for others. Again, independently, our second measure of sunlight exposure, huge reductions in death, all-cause death. So the benefits of sunlight for a British population vastly outweigh any hazards in a middle-aged cohort studied over 12 years, because it's always within your group. So that's us. Has anyone else done this? Well, yes, actually, the first person to do this was Pelle Lindqvist, also at the Karolinska. So Pelle is an obstetrician, and he was looking at this Swedish study, the melanoma in southern Sweden study, 30,000 Swedish women which was a quarter of the population of southern Swedish women when the study was set up in 1990, asked 4 questions about sunlight exposure, extensively adjusted for lifestyle, social, health confounders. They went back 25 years later. The aim of this study was to find how much sunlight led to melanoma and how much it killed. The expectation was more sunlight, more melanoma, more deaths. That was the expectation when it was set up. Instead, what Pelle found was that the more sunlight people had 0 to 4, the less their risks of being dead. Those that had the most sunlight were half as likely to be dead as those that had the least. So, hypertension is the biggest killer globally. Nitric oxide released by UV lowers blood pressure. And in high latitude countries like Britain and Europe, the more sunlight people get, the longer they live. Skin color determines our response to UV, as we said. So look, there's a really interesting thing here. So the evolutionary thing, all of us come from Africa, and we left Africa, we arose in Africa about 200,000 years ago, arrived in Europe about 45,000 years ago, arrived in China about 45,000 years ago. 2 technologies have come together in the last 5 or 6 years, maybe a bit longer. The first one is ancient DNA. In fact, Pelle's former lab mate, Svante, what's Svante's surname, got the Nobel Prize for Medicine 3 years ago for ancient DNA. We can now get DNA from ancient skeletons and sequence it due to Svante's work. And the other thing is that we understand the genetics of pigment. We've got to really understand the genetics of skin pigmentation in the last 5 or 10 years. And broadly, there's about 20 genes that affect pigmentation, but 4 or 5 really important ones. So what has happened, this lower map shows UV around the world. Humans who moved to China, East Asia, developed pale skin via a KIT LG, via a particular genetic variant. Humans who moved to Europe in the Fertile Crescent about 8,000 years ago, independently via a different genetic route, also evolved pale skin. So what happens here is independently and repeatedly, humans who move to low light environments develop pale skin. Skin color determines your response to UV. There have to be benefits to sunlight because whenever humans move to low sunlight environments, they will evolve pale skin. There isn't time to go into the arguments more greatly here, but what is really interesting is it only happened really recently. We've been in Europe about 45,000 years, China about 45,000 years too, but pale skin only arises in Europe about 8,000 years ago, and it only arrives in the Fertile Crescent. It only arrives in Britain about 5,000 years ago. So the people who built Maze House, Skara Brae, and Orkney, like Stonehenge, down in England, those are about 5,000 years ago. And the first Britons had dark skin. So this is Cheddar Man, who's 10,000, oldest Briton we know of. This is Ötzi, the Iceman, who was found in that glacier in the Tyrol about 10 years ago. So Ötzi has brown skin. Look, he's got brown skin. They did his gene sequencing year before last. He's got brown skin from 5,000 years ago. The people who painted the rock art on those caves in the Dordogne, the amazing, all those mammoths and woolly tigers and things, had dark skin. The shift to white skin in Europe and the shift to white skin in China only occurs when we move from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. So white skin evolves for humans who've moved to low light environments and are farmers. Most of the time that Europe and Britain have been populated, they've been populated by dark skinned hunter-gatherers. So what is it about farming? And you need the two together because farming has independently evolved in different parts of the world. But it's being a farmer in a low light environment leads to the evolutionary fitness advantage for pale skin. And just to say, look, we think it's probably, I think it's probably infection, because when you start being a farmer is when infectious disease becomes prevalent, because most infectious disease comes from animals, what we call zoonotic. COVID comes from bats, flu, chickens, measles, pigs, blah, 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 and so on and so on. And also when you're a farmer, you're living in communities where disease can spread. Whereas as a hunter-gatherer, you're spread out over the landscape and don't meet many people and can't pass disease on. Anyway, a quick paper, we showed that more UV, less COVID deaths, and a rival group in America showed the same thing, and we have these seasonal influenza. There's not time to touch upon this. So, pale skin, I'm going to skip the melanoma stuff because we haven't got time. Look, I'm just going to finish off here with where are sunlight advice. So, basically, sunlight makes you live longer, it lowers blood pressure, it reduces all-cause mortality. The benefits vastly outweigh the hazards. So, but what's our advice on sunlight? Well, it comes from Australia. So look, 30 years ago, I did 5 years of general internal medicine before I started my dermatology. And this bottom left picture, this handsome young man, is me a lifetime ago, me 32 years ago, as a medical registrar in Cairns in Queensland. So this is Cairns up here. So our advice on sunlight exposure is copied directly from Australia. Slip, slap, slop. Don't go out between 11 and 3 without sunscreen. This is the Scottish official guidance. All children at nursery in Scotland have to slip, slap, slop. If they're allowed out of a state nursery, like my kids were at between 11 and 3, they have to have sunscreen applied so they don't get skin cancer. This is the Australian advice. So in Cairns, mid-winter, mid-June, The UV index for about an hour in the middle of the day is 7. And in summer, it's 14. So 7 is the darkest time of year, 14. If I have an open audience, I ask people to guess how many weeks the UV index hits 7 in Scotland. So in Scotland, but I don't, so I'll have to tell you. So in Scotland, we measure the UV index in Glasgow. So the last, so it's always a year behind us. So in 2023, the UV index in Glasgow hit 7 for, I think it's about 10 minutes, on the 24th of June, just after lunch. So, and in last year, 2024, the UV index did not hit 7 at all. So in the last 2 years, we've had a midwinter level of Australian sunshine for 10 minutes in 2 years. And yet our advice is to copy Australian advice on sunlight exposure. So look, I'm actually going to, there's not time to talk about the melanoma stuff, and it's quite medical, so I'm going to skip over that. But I'm really just going to finish off by saying that I think we've got our sunlight message completely wrong. The benefits of sunlight vastly outweigh the risks. All-cause mortality is the ultimate thing. You know, how does sunlight make you live longer, or does sunlight make you live shorter? And our data, and the data from Scandinavia, is that the more sunlight people get, the longer they live. And that's the first and most important stuff. And the question is, how can we get more sunlight into our lives? So, yeah.
So I'm going to kick off with a question straight away, and just want to remind everyone that the Q&A section, do please, if you have questions, post them in there. But so, do you have any ideas that, for winter, harvesting of UV for people, if I wanted to increase my or decrease my risk, let's say, of cardiovascular mortality, and yet we're going through this season where there's very little UV, what would I do?
I don't think there's much. I do not think. Look, we are at the northern fringes of where mankind has moved to. You know, this is the furthest north Homo sapiens has got to, and I suspect the lack of light is a limiting factor. You know, we've been up here recently. It's not. We are an African. We are a naked, diurnal, day active African primate. That's what we are. And here we are really pushing the limits of what we're physiologically adapted to. And it's a really interesting question what we can do. Of course, historically, we have spent our entire evolutionary history outdoors all day, every day. We were hunter-gatherers, then we were farmers. Our skin color adapted to how much or how little sunlight there was, and we were outdoors all day, every day. 150 years ago, 6 generations, the Industrial Revolution, we moved indoors. Well, hang on, we've had 200,000 years as Homo sapiens, several million years as hominids, outdoors all day, every day. And now we have this utterly artificial situation of being indoors every day, protected from the light. I don't think we can get enough. I think we should be adapting building design to maximize the sunlight we get and the closest to natural sunlight. So that's an interesting, when I worked in Germany, by law, every German office has to have a window. Humans have to have windows. There's no such law in Britain. So what happens in the university is, the PhD students live in the bowels of the building and never see daylight. They emerge briefly, blinking, but are back there. Senior directors of institutes have corner offices with windows on 2 sides and light pouring in. Light's a luxury here, and I think light's a necessity. So I think we really need to be looking at building design to try and maximize, to reduce the damage we get. At the moment, regulations around building design, a lot of them are around thermal efficiency, We have a lot, and it is cheaper to insulate a wall than a window. So again, richer people have bigger windows. Council houses, poorer people have smaller windows. I think actually designing our buildings to maximize light getting in is really essential. So I think we do that, and that's reducing the harm of lack of sunlight. I think we then need to be looking at getting, I think probably exogenous artificial light is going to be required. And I think there's a huge amount about the environment in which we live. And yeah, if you can take sunny holidays midwinter, I absolutely recommend them.
So I'm going to pass over to a few questions that have cropped up. Actually, my other half, Helen, has fired a few questions over. Actually, there's a few questions coming through. So first of all, is there a need to wear sun cream on a sunbed?
I think so. I think the important thing is not to get sunburned. That's it. So look, so melanoma is the skin cancer which dermatologists worry about. And the risk factor for melanoma is sunburn in childhood. So kids should not get sunburnt. Beyond that, don't get sunburnt. I have to say I have a conflict of interest here. I think sunscreens should be better than they are. At the moment, sunscreens block nitric oxide release. And that is a concern because NO is what lowers blood pressure and reduces heart disease, and sunscreens block that. I think sunscreens could be better than they are. I'll put it there, but don't get burnt is the main one.
So another one from Helen. When should we wear sun cream, and if we should, what factor should it be?
So sunscreens. Here's the news. Sunscreens prevent photo aging. So pretty much all cosmetic products now contain sunscreen because sunscreen causes photo aging, and people don't want to look photo aged. My own stuff, I've developed a nitric oxide releasing substance you can put in sunscreen that restores that NO release. I think that should be in all sun compounds. Zero interest from industry because they've done the same thing always. Well, we just avoid the sun. No, it's far more complex than that. So existing sunscreens, I think you have a trade-off here. I think we need more sunlight. And all I would say is don't get burned. For the cosmetics of not photo aging, do you want to look old or do you want to be old? I think there's a choice between the two there.
It's an interesting choice, isn't it? And actually, just carrying on from what we've just been saying, Arno just posed the question. More exposure to sunlight makes us live longer, but what are the long-term damages from sunburns on the skin?
Yeah, so look, so sunburn in childhood is increased risk of melanoma. I think the risks of death from melanoma are less, however. So look, so there's been a huge increase in the number of melanomas diagnosed in the last 40, 50 years. There hasn't been a change in the deaths from melanomas. And really lack of time, I can't go on forever. But we have overstated, I believe we have overstated the hazards of sunlight on causing definitely fatal melanoma. I'm going to quickly show you, as an answer to this question, I'm just going to show you a quick graph here on melanoma, some melanoma data. So, let me come and do this. So I'm just showing you here. Oh gosh, sorry. Apologies if you're in a meeting, you rattle through the next slide bit. So this is that showing on the screen? Does it say rapid rise in cutaneous melanoma diagnoses? So
yes, it
can
does.
You see this? Okay, so this is a paper published in the New England Journal by a super chap, Day Adamson, who is a dermatologist who I greatly admire in America. So in America, in the last 40 years, there has been a 6-fold rise in the number of melanomas diagnosed, but no change in deaths from melanoma. And to me, as a doctor, what matters is people not dying of melanoma. In Denmark, so that's 1975 onwards. In Denmark, in 1955, 2.5 per 100,000 people were diagnosed with melanoma, and 2.5 per 100,000 people died from melanoma. So the number, so basically, all the melanomas diagnosed 70 years ago, melanoma killed people. Today, the cases of melanoma in Denmark have increased 20 times over, 45 per 100,000. The deaths, unchanged. Now, what it turns out is driving this is the harder you look for melanomas, the more biopsies you do, the more melanomas you find. And we have this huge issue of what's called overdiagnosis of melanomas, meaning we are finding melanomas which, if we hadn't found them, probably wouldn't have done anything. We've had this idea that melanoma as an inevitable death sentence, and unless you catch them early, it will kill you. That is probably untrue. What's probably the case is that the harder we look, the more biopsies we do, the more we find. But if we hadn't done it, probably those melanomas just would have sat there, kept under control by the immune system. So look, so the dermatology line here is, oh my God, there's an epidemic of melanoma. We need more dermatologists looking harder. The more dermatologists we have, the more we find. Thank God they were there, or we wouldn't have found them. And dermatologists say, isn't it amazing? 70 years ago in Denmark, 100% of people died of melanoma. Now only 5% die of melanoma. My line is, all of those dermatologists and deaths from melanoma are utterly unchanged. Huge increases in manpower. You've made not a pip of difference on reducing deaths from melanoma. This is an artifact of overdiagnosis. Same thing in Britain. So in Britain, when I started my training off in 1993, there were 10 per 100,000 cases of melanoma and 4 per 100,000 deaths. It's now risen to, we've now got almost 30 cases of melanoma per 100,000, and the deaths are unchanged. And this is the number of dermatologists. So there were 300 dermatologists in Britain when I started my training. There's now 1,000, figures here for England and Wales. The more dermatologists we have, the more melanomas we diagnose, no difference to the number of melanomas that people die of. So cases of melanoma behave entirely differently from deaths from melanoma. And what we probably have is we have probably got a significant problem with, I suspect there are these grumbling low-grade melanomas, which of course we always cut out. And we are doing all of this activity to find them. But if we hadn't found them, I suspect in most cases, nothing would have happened. But that is, the whole service has been turned over to, oh my God, there's an epidemic. We have to find them. I think it is, I think we're wasting time, resources, and energy that we could be using better elsewhere.
There's a question from Bob Fosbury. How do we distinguish between the UV and NIR positive effects of sunlight? And then the point then is we need the entire solar spectrum to thrive.
Yeah. Look, so it's really quite hard to pick these apart. So look, I've got our data are more sunlight, longer life. So more sunlight, longer life. There's then the second, so the first question is, does sunlight make you live longer? To which the answer is yes, it does. So you need more of it. The second order question is, which bits of sunlight? Well, that then gets harder. And the answer is we don't know. And we know that full spectrum sunlight, the full lot, is good for you. And I think you start from that. look, I think I think we need to be getting out. The problem is that research has utterly been focused on the harmful side effects of sunlight. All we have looked at is the harmful effects. There's been no thought about the benefits, and the work has not been done. It's unfundable. I mean, it has been unfundable. I've had very little research funding in my life. It's mostly been PhD students, sort of self-funded PhD students, because it hasn't been seen as a priority. And we haven't stood back and said, what's the big picture? Does cigarettes shorten life? Absolutely. Every cigarette shortens your life by about 4 minutes per cigarette. High blood pressure, reduce your blood pressure by 20-30% reduction in chances of death, which goes in. Cholesterol, you go to your GP feeds your cholesterol into a calculator, it gives you your risk of death in the next 10 years, and you adjust your cholesterol based on that. Poverty, you can look at how much poverty reduces life. All of these things shorten life, and we have robust, hard data. Sunlight lengthens life. So what the hell are we doing going around telling people to avoid it? It lengthens life. The first question is, if it lengthens your life, how can we get more of it? I mean, absolutely. It's as if, and the problem is dermatologists have said, "Oh, sunlight's our thing. We dictate it. It's bad for you." It's rather as if psychiatrists had taken over smoking. Oh my gosh, cigarettes. They reduce people's stress. They reduce. Do you know how many people are dying of suicide because they're stressed? Look at all these suicide deaths. Everybody should smoke. Everybody should at least 20 a day. Sunlight. Of course, cigarettes kill people. So of course you're not going to do it. Yeah, it may reduce your stress, but it kills you, so we don't do it. And sunlight, absolutely craziness.
I've got a question from Iffy. Hello, Iffy. Thanks for joining. So first of all, Iffy said, amazing talk. I couldn't stop taking notes. Thank you. So the question is from Iffy, do you use sunbeds? And if yes, what parameters would you suggest for one to look for? Are there concerns regarding sunbeds?
Yeah, so I don't use sunbeds myself. I go on sunny holidays. I use sunbeds in my research. So I think what's really interesting is the mechanism stuff, and that's why it's fun to do research. The nitric oxide pathway I spoke about because I've done the work. It's there, it's published. It's a really important pathway. I think the major benefits of sunlight and health are via my nitric oxide pathway. Look, that's what's going on my tombstone. Richard Weller, the guy who discovered NO and sunlight. That's that's my kind of in my obituary. I think there are probably other mechanisms. What is really interesting is clearly sunlight. I mean, isn't it ridiculous? For sunlight, we've had two things: causes skin cancer, avoid it. Vitamin D, take vitamin D supplements. Live in a cave has been the kind of dermatology advice. Well, skin cancer overstated. Vitamin D, way more than vitamin D. So we've got the vitamin D pathway, we've got the nitric oxide pathway, myopia, mechanism not known, except more, daylight. Being more daylight reduces myopia and thus blindness. Circadian rhythms, blue light, the kind of dopamine, all that melatonin pathways. So I'm currently very interested. This reduction in cancer deaths with sunlight is really interesting. So we know that people with higher measured vitamin D levels are much less likely to die of cancer, including, I might say, melanoma. People with high vitamin D levels are less likely to have a melanoma diagnosis and less likely to die of melanoma. But when you give vitamin D to people with cancer or with melanoma, it has no effect on survival. So it's not the vitamin D. It looks like it's the sunlight. So at the moment, I am doing experiments, and I do experiments in winter. I've got an amazing PhD student, Ajayu Gu, who's just fantastic. And in winter, we take healthy subjects, again, medical students, I can't afford mice, and we load them up with vitamin D tablets for a month beforehand. So they start with high vitamin D levels. So we can say this is not a vitamin D effect because they had high vitamin D levels at the start. We take blood from them and we do what's called single cell sequencing. So we look at 10,000 different cells, mostly immune cells in the blood. And in each of those 10,000 cells, we look at every single gene which is turned on or turned off. the transcription pathway. We then give them 2 weeks of daily UV from the closest to natural sunlight, which is an old-fashioned tanning lamp. So I have Clio bulbs, which are the old-fashioned tanning bulbs, which are the closest to the solar spectrum. They have daily UV for 2 weeks, and we then repeat it. And what we are finding, this is work we're doing at the moment, not yet published, working away at it. We find that sunlight has a big effect on increasing the diversity of your T cell receptors. So your immune system basically becomes far more diverse, far more able to deal with fresh infections, fresh cancers. I suppose it's an educated immune system better able to do with new things it comes across. And I suspect, we suspect, it's the work we're doing, our hypothesis is that this UV-driven activation of the immune system is important to reduce infections, cancers. And we know that we have a reduction in cancers with UV because that's what the epidemiology shows. And the next is to look at the mechanism. So that's using old-fashioned UV lamps. I've had the tanning industry approaching me in the past saying, can I go and give them talks and things? And I say no. Conflicts of interest are really important. And it would be lovely to get funding. I spend my life not getting funding. Those experiments, those nitric oxide experiments, that forearm plethysmography, we were infusing a drug into the forearm to turn off the nitric oxide synthase. It cost £5,000 for the 12 subjects. So I don't do private practice, but I went and did NHS overtime clinics for 3 months to pay for that drug to do those experiments. So I went off and I worked my backside off to pay for which is why I get hacked off by the social media influencers just saying garbage, the kind of conspiracy theorists out there. If you believe something, do the experiments, prove it. Can't afford it? Go and work for 3 months to raise the money to do the experiments. That's what I do, and this kind of, opinions are fine, evidence doesn't matter. No, evidence matters. Data matters. Get out and do the work and prove it, because science is based on data, not shouting loudly. So the answer is, I suspect I am not opposed to sunbeds, and it's amazing how many of my patients use them when they know I'm not opposed to them. So I'm neutral on them. I suspect that something in that spectrum is going to be needed,
Yep.
But I don't want to be at risk of the medical world saying he's been bought by the tanning industry. I'm independent and untarnished by that. It would be much easier to take the money and have a nice life, but the good science comes first.
So Anna Levin, I don't know if you know Anna. Anna wrote a book, beautiful book, called Incandescent. So she's asked the question: you seem to be talking about sunlight and UV interchangeably, as if they're synonymous. Can you tell a bit more about this?
Yeah.
And what about other aspects of sunlight?
Yeah, look, good question. Look, so the epidemiology is sunlight. I have to say, with the sunlight, we have particularly looked at the UV spectrum when doing the observational studies, trying to pick apart. So when look, I started with UV because I'm a dermatologist, and that's my background. Prejudices, I suppose. I started off thinking, oh my gosh, UV skin cancer. So my initial experiments were with UV because that's what dermatologists are interested in. Whereas ophthalmologists are interested in visible light, and we all start from where we start. My initial experiments showing that nitric oxide was released from the skin, I was using UVA. Now, the reason I used UVA was it doesn't make vitamin D, and I wanted to show that this was a vitamin D independent effect, which I did. I then slightly got trapped into the UVA world, like to get funding, for the next experiments. People said, well, you've shown it's UVA, you need to stick with UVA, because research funders want incremental changes. They don't want to take a risk about funding something entirely different. You want to build on where you've been. But my suspicion, actually, for physicochemical reasons, actually absorption of UV, which chemical bonds, what wavelengths chemical bonds absorb, is that I actually think probably UVB is more important. And when we were looking at our data in America, the dialysis patients who we were looking at the sunlight they got, the UV they got, I'm sorry, and blood pressure, we found that UVB, so shorter than UVA, was more effective than UVA at releasing, at lowering blood pressure. I then had a super Brazilian PhD student, Milena Pellegrino, over with me for 3 months. Her PhD supervisor, her professor, Maya Seabra, also from Brazil, came and did part of a PhD with me decades ago, now sending over his students. Now, Milena is a really good chemist, and I had her for 3 months, and I had her for 3 months because that's the maximum time you get a bloody student visa. And she was funded by the Royal Society to come to me. And we had 3 months because that's how long her visa was. And we did experiments looking at which wavelengths release nitric oxide. So because of Planck's, somebody's law, whose law is it? Anyway, more energy, lower wavelengths. We started with short wavelengths, so the UVB wavelengths, because you get more energy for, per photon at the shorter wavelengths. So we could do the experiments shorter irradiation times with UVB, and then we gradually moved our experiments along towards UVA, ultimately going towards visible to see for nitric oxide release. But because of whoever's constant it is, the fact you get less energy with longer wavelengths, the irradiations took longer and longer, the experiments, and she only was here for 3 months. So because of visa restrictions on visiting students, we started with UVB and we just nudged into UVA, and then her visa was up and she had to leave. And we published half a paper. Why do we publish half a paper? Because of visa restrictions. And I'm, don't have the funding. It'd be great to have a great big lab full of scientists who could have carried it on. But the point was, we showed that UVB was actually very effective at releasing nitric oxide. So that's that. For my experiments now, I'm looking at gene regulation. Well, we're using tanning lamps because I'm trying to get as close to sunlight as we can. So they're going through to the blue end of visible. They're these old-fashioned tanning lamps, which are the modern tanning lamps tend to not have much UVB in them. And I want, a bit of UVB, UVA, and through to visible. So, yeah.
Okay. Dorrit has posted a question, and there's some big words there, so I'm going to try and read them properly. Has there been any research into the effect of sunlight and scleroderma stroke systemic sclerosis,
Yep.
an autoimmune disease which essentially is overproduction of collagen, which hardens and thickens the skin? In
Yep.
effect, this causes issues with blood circulation, Raynaud's, internal issues to the heart and lungs, such as pulmonary hypertension. Patients often also develop a darker stroke tanned skin color.
Yep, very much in our ballpark in dermatology. So there's a cutaneous sclerosis and a systemic sclerosis. So cutaneous sclerosis, where you get those waxy changes in the skin. UVA1, long wavelength UVA, is very effective for that. Now, there is a real problem in Britain that I think only 2 places have UVA1. They're long wavelength UV tubes, Dundee and St John's down in London. Clinical trials show really effective. And I'm thinking, hang on, it's pretty much the same wavelength as tanning lamps. So a friend of mine approached me who's been diagnosed with cutaneous sclerosis, and I said, well, it's systemic drugs or UVA1, which is unobtainable. Oh my God, it's radiation, got to be careful. Hang on. And I suggested to my friend she goes to a tanning salon, because actually, now, look, purists will say, oh, well, UVA1 is tightly constrained with just those bits of UV, long UV. Tanning lamps go either side of it. Maybe there's a downside. Maybe there is, but I suspect not. If I had cutaneous sclerosis, I would go to a tanning lamp.
Okay. Taylor has asked another question. Does SPF values have any effect
Mm.
on nitric oxide,
Yep.
or does SPF value like 15 or 50 block NO equally?
Yep. So absolutely. So the conflict of interest, this is, what I've been looking at, and we've got a patent, no products or anything, kind of interesting research to me. So for the purpose, we used SPF 50, absolute mega sunblock, highest you can find, and we found that blocks nitric oxide release when UV hits the skin. Whether lower SPFs reduce it less, I suspect lower SPFs reduce it less, because a bit gets through, and it's physical, it's photochemistry. UV hits the nitrates in the presence of thiols, and you'll release NO. And I suspect that's a fairly dose-dependent response going on. And SPF, that's a dose response, the SPF. So I suspect the higher the SPF, the more NO that's blocked.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
yeah,
I mean, yeah. I mean, I suppose it's unknown for the moment, isn't it?
yeah. Well, and of course, it's not. No one's looked. No, research funding is difficult. I've had very little research funding in my life. What I'm a dermatologist, but I'm talking about blood pressure and all-cause mortality. That's not what dermatologists do. And then for the hypertension doctors, hang on, what's a dermatologist telling us? It is now beginning to change. I'm now beginning to get invited to the top tables. I'm beginning to be I'm asked to go and speak at blood pressure meetings. I'm asked to speak at the big dermatology meetings. But I've been doing it for 30 years, and it's only just, it is, look, I think medicine's got this badly wrong, and medicine does. And peanuts is the classic one. Peanut allergy, it turns out, is caused by peanut avoidance. And until 5 years ago, the official guidance from the British uh, pediatricians and the Americans and the Europeans was children should avoid peanuts. If you got a mother with A to B, that peanuts should be avoided till they were 2. And then it was realized that the epidemic of peanut allergy, you have a genuine epidemic of peanut allergy. People eat peanuts, fall over with anaphylaxis. It turns out, and trials were done to prove it, that it's caused by peanut avoidance. And there's been a complete reversal 2 years ago of advice. And now it is recommended that children are weaned onto peanuts as early as you can, 6 months, but probably 4 months is more important. So the complete reversal. And medicine gets it wrong, but medicine is not a conspiracy. It's science. It is self-correcting. But you need to get out there. Changes are always slow. Most new ideas are batty and wrong, but they're not always batty and wrong. And you have to pick out what's real and what's not real. And you do that with developing the data. And you always start off with an uphill struggle. And that's not that it's evil. It's just that you've got to prove your case.
Thank you. Wolfgang from Foster and Partners, thank you for joining, Wolfgang has asked, should we be dabbling with artificial sources of UV? I think it's a relevant question in terms of the built
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah, really interesting question, Wolfgang. So look, I'm just across from the art college here in Edinburgh, where the architects are. I think building design hugely important. I think the built environment hugely important. And one of the interesting things we're talking to Ulis here really is, I've been in my dermatology ghetto, gradually expanding it. And I think we need to design our buildings better. I think we need to design our lighting better. I think straight off we need to have more light in our lives as much as we can. The Germans have got it right. The British have got it wrong. And we need light needs to be engineered into our lives, and our regulations and advice and good practice needs to steer towards that. As a start with, that's no passive, let's get as much daylight in our lives as we can. Next thing is artificial light. Yeah, I think we need to move towards that. So look, the real answer for the questions is we need to do the research. And all the research has been, oh my God, see no evil, sunlight evil, UV evil. It's clearly far more to it than that. the all-cause mortality data is so powerful. It's me here, or it's us here, it's Sweden, it's Norway, every high latitude country where they're looking at this, they're finding the more sunlight you have, the longer people live. That has to be important. The seasonal thing, look, as winter bed crises, for 2,500 years, as a junior doctor, now I'm a dermatologist, life is easier. When I was a junior doctor doing internal medicine, there's a kind of, it's not a written rule, but it's an unspoken rule. It is bad manners. It is not supporting the team to go on holiday in winter, because in winter, doctors are really busy. If you're a hospital doctor, winter's bloody hell, because you are swamped. You've got, well, nowadays, God, you've got people on corridors. You are overwhelmed. And taking holiday then, I mean, you're allowed to in your contract, but there's just an unspoken rule you don't do it because we're coping with a deluge of patients. So it's polite for the team to take your holidays in summer. This has to tell us something. And of course, it's so normal that you say, why is the hospital busy and busy? Well, because it's winter. That's not an answer. That is restating the question. Why is it busy? And we said, oh, vitamin D. It's not vitamin D. We've done the trials. Temperature. Look, people have central heating. Look, it's a cold day. I'm wearing my skiing thermals at the moment because I cycle to work. And I'm in a chilly building and I come from a chilly home. So I wear my thermals. So my temperature's fine. It's we just have this. It's so normal that people are less healthy in winter. We just accept it. We can engineer our way out of this, but we need to raise the question and talk about it. And architects, honestly, you guys control the world we live in. I suspect that geography and architecture, I think this is going to be like the Clean Air Acts. I think it is like sewers. I think this is like these huge structural things we've done which have improved our life. So the reason for me, this whole thing about was an infection that drove the move to white skin. Well, of course, the last 100 years, we've sorted infection out. And actually, we didn't really, antibiotics helped a bit. The big things that sorted infection out were sewers, clean air, vaccinations. These amazing structural changes that radically alter life, from my point of view, mucked up the bloody data. You can't see the effects of sunlight on infectious disease because we bloody built our way out of it. So COVID came along, wow, fantastic, new disease, no defenses, let's see what it does to the population. And we and others showed that more sunlight, less COVID deaths. Wow, really interesting. Now we've got vaccines, the data's hidden again, because vaccines will stop people dying, which obviously is a good thing. But if you're after the data and the evolutionary drivers, mucks it all up.
So we've got one last question, it seems, from Dave Grassi. Dave's actually based in Canada, so thank you very much for joining, Dave. Adding IR and UV to current artificial light sources will reduce the efficacy, therefore resulting in less energy savings than we have today. How can we balance these health benefits with the need for continual reduced energy consumption?
Yeah, look, the IR stuff is new to me, and I've started looking at this. It's not my field. What I'm going to say about all my experiments are based on studies in man, and I think this is really important. So we have looked at sunlight and all-cause mortality, UV and nitric studies in man. I think at the moment we don't have enough evidence. The IR stuff I need to look into more. So there's all this stuff about IR and energy production and mitochondria. Energy by itself is part of the energy as used by the body. It needs to be regulated and focused. We use energy to killing infectious organisms is an energetic process. Muscles moving is an energetic process. The brain working is an energetic process. And it uses energy, but it's highly focused energy, within cells in very specific locations. And energy, there's a difference in a nuclear explosion and a nuclear power plant. One of these is very focused energy, and one of these is unbelievably destructive. And it's the same with energy production in the body. And I'm not, I don't want to speak about the IR, not my thing. I think the answer is we need to do the research. Look, I think at the moment sunlight's the starting point, isn't it? I think we know that sunlight makes us live longer. Sunlight correlates with longer life. Observational studies, me falling into the classic mistake. Sunlight correlates with longer life in a way which I think is strongly suggestive of causation. And I think we do more of it in our lives.
Amazing. I think we've run through all the questions. And it's been absolutely wonderful presentation, and I really thank you for your time, Richard. Just interesting understanding different aspects of light and how they impact our physiology, whether it's UV, whether it's IR. We're starting to understand that there are some things that are missing. And I think when we go back to the sort of notion that we spend 90% of our time indoors, that's a pretty solid sunscreen, isn't it, by itself?
Yeah.
And we're just missing out on something that we've evolved with over thousands of years, and we've taken it all away. So really interesting to understand how to hear you talk about how there seems to be a link between solar exposure and a reduction in all-cause mortality. Before we sort of finish off, there is a terminology that I've come across, or that I've heard about, and I think it was in one of the talks that you might have done with Max down in Australia. He refers to solar calluses. And I wonder, just maybe as the last question, what your thought is on his ideas of solar calluses.
Oh, I have to. Not sure. Yeah, and he used a phrase, and I can't remember what it referred to, so I'm not gonna.
Okay.
Australian sun very different from Scottish sun or English sun, even. A very different UV environment. So yeah.
Okay, no, fair point. So listen, thank you so much for your time today. I think through the number of questions that we've had, I think there's been obviously a lot of interest in the talk. We'll obviously publish it on our YouTube channel. And for anyone who's interested, next month we're talking to Ty Farrow from Farrow Architects. He is a Canadian architect who is specializing in salutogenic design within buildings. Salutogenic being causing health rather than pathogenic, which is about causing disease or giving disease. So it should be very, very interesting. And Richard, I think we will try and hook up with Bob and Glenn at some point in the not too distant future, so we can talk about our human sort of need for the full solar spectrum.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.